from the beginning, we've seen that the letter was a good chance. There's a good chance that the letter was actually written by the Apostle Peter, if not by somebody who was either a close follower or someone who was honouring Peter with the letter. But there's a good chance it was written by the Apostle himself. And it was written to people who are called exiles in the Anatolia Peninsula, in what is modern day Turkey, and people who, a community that is in some way alienated from the society in which they are living, whether they've been displaced from somewhere and had to move into that area, or seems more likely, or whether they are under some kind of local persecution of Christians, or more likely they are in some way alienated from the prevailing pagan society in which they were living, and they're called to what is a living hope, and called to live kind of separate lives, but also lives that go alongside the existing society. And they're described, as we saw last week, as a holy priesthood, living stones to offer spiritual sacrifices, a chosen race. So they are Gentiles, although there's lots of references to Hebrew scriptures in the book, but they are Gentiles, but they are called into God's people. They are called into Israel. And where we ended last week was this quote from Hosea, which Peter uses: once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you have not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. That's where I think we were. And now we can read quite a lengthy chunk of 1 Peter, which is the kind of middle section of this book. Yeah, can you see this? 1 Peter 2:11 to 4:11. We'll do it little section at a time. It is a long section, but may be useful to read the whole thing first. And if I could prevail upon Harley.
Yeah, for sure.
You're just so faithful.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Right. So here we go. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that, though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme, or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone. Love the family of the believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is to your credit if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, where is the credit in that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that, free from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands, so that, even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Rather, let your adornment be the inner self with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. It was this way long ago that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is good and never let fears alarm you. Husbands, in the same way, show consideration for your wives and your life together, paying honor to the woman as the weaker sex, since they too are also heirs of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing may hinder your prayers. Finally, all of you have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you are called, that you might inherit a blessing. For those who desire life and desire to see good days, let them keep their tongues from evil and their lips from speaking deceit. Let them turn away from evil and do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated, but in your hearts sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an account of the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear, so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your own good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins once and for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 people, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers made subject to him. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same intention, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has finished with sin, so as to live the rest of your earthly life no longer by human desires, but by the will of God. You have already spent enough time in doing what the Gentiles like to do, living in licentiousness, passions, drunkenness, revels, carousing, and lawless idolatry. They are surprised that you no longer join them with the same excesses of this fashion, and so they blaspheme. But they will have to give an account to him who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead, so that, though they have been judged in the flesh as everyone is judged, they might live in the spirit as God does. The end of all things is near. Therefore be serious and discipline yourselves for the sake of your prayers. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies, so that God may be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen.
Or, I mean, it's a long passage, and I'm sure there are some little bits which leapt out of the page to you and made you want to say no.
Or just go, oh gosh, why am I reading this?
Yeah, exactly.
Sort
Do I really believe
humiliating experience? Thanks for, thanks for that one.
That's why I chose you. That's why I asked.
Yeah, he's just trying to humiliate me. Of course he is. Yeah.
Well, I think when you come across those passages, it's easy just to say, "Oh, forget that," put them on one side and not tackle them. But I think actually, I think with this, I think it's worth looking a bit more closely at what is being said, because to the modern ears, some of it sounds, pretty awful. Let's do it just section at a time. I think that's the only way to do it, and I hope we kind of manage to get through the whole of this long passage. Maybe not looking in as much detail as we have in other weeks. But the first couple of verses, beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourself honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they may line you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to church. Okay, I mean, I think just it sort of says what it says, but it begins with that word beloved. So, which is consistent, with the command for mutual love that we heard about in the first chapter of this, and this kind of intimate relationship that the apostle appears to have with this community, even though there's no record of Peter having visited those communities. And the aliens and the exiles, they're kind of two words more or less saying the same thing, but this ambiguity is really in the letter between the physical exile, the actual experience of being displaced from one place to another is there, and also this sense of being alienated, being distant from the society around you, from the society's values and institutions, and the politics is there. But verse 12 kind of gives you a kind of introduction to the whole passage. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers. So this community is in some way under attack or misunderstood. Actually, the way to counter the criticism of the community is actually to do deeds that are good, and to keep their conduct pure and wholesome. So, anybody want to say anything about that little section?
I think verse 12 is the key to what follows, because the idea, I think, is that he's saying, don't rock the boat, don't do stuff that's going to get you into trouble with the authorities. So go along with some of their ways, even if you don't agree with it, because there's, in his mind, there's a higher aim at stake, a higher end at stake. Now, I think we would take issue with that, but I think in his context, it makes sense for them not to challenge some of these, what he would say, subsidiary issues to the furtherance of the gospel.
I mean, they're small communities, in a very fragile new communities. I mean, being very brave and putting themselves in potentially dangerous, difficult situations.
It'd be interesting to ask Peter, some generations later, do you still agree with what you said, or or would you say? And I think it's a reminder that all these letters are written to particular situations. They're not written to everyone in every time and every place. So what's relevant then may not be relevant now.
Although I think in these sections, he starts with something that's for everybody. Then he has this little section for the slaves. Then he has a little section about the example of Christ. And then he has a little bit for the wives and the husbands. And then he has some instructions for everybody. So it does kind of move from the general to the
Yes.
particular.
Yes.
So let's look at verse 13 to 17. Because this is one of the tough ones. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right we should silence the ignorant of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people. Yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. What I should have said actually was that in Roman society, the household code was very significant. The way in which the institution of the household was structured, with the man, the father of the family, pater familias, at the head, and that model of the household was reproduced as the model of the state. So the state institutions arise out of the household. And then here we are. What do you make of this little passage? Honor the emperor.
No way. No, it's just
No way. Well, what? I mean, it's very, very interesting.
well, yeah.
Accepting the authority of every human institution.
I mean, we sort of do to an extent, don't we?
Don't we?
We sort of do in a way, but I assume we all pay our taxes. And there's sort of an extent to which we all do that, even if we kind of say, "Oh, I don't like Rishi Sunak" or whatever. It kind of anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean it's true. I mean the institutions of the state, I mean, are they're real, and they're hard to count. But look,
but
Graham.
but if you look at this paragraph, he's not saying merely obey the Roman authorities. He's saying honor them.
Yes.
Which is much stronger, and it presupposes that the Christians are supposed to go on along with this, with all the structure of honor that held the Roman Empire together.
But there's some really interesting thing about the honor, because if you look at verse 17, it says honor everyone. First of all, honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. So actually, that's the subversive little part of it. Honor everyone is the subversive part, because that isn't, the Roman way. Not everybody is honored. It is the emperor and it is the state that is honored. And also, if you look at verse 16, as servants of God, live as free people. Do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. So first of all, you are a servant of God and you are free. And so you're not being required in this sense to submit in a kind of resignation. You're not to resign yourself to what's going on in the society. We don't resign ourselves to Rishi Sunak being appointed Prime Minister or Suella Braverman becoming Home Secretary. We don't resign ourselves to that. But we don't, we don't wait for the opportunity for the change to come. But that idea that you're a free person, first of all, and with that freedom, you can honor everyone. With that, you have the freedom to honor the emperor, as opposed to you have to do that because you're not a free person.
Doesn't it? I mean, all of it seems to be around this word honor. And that goes back to verse 12, where we're told to conduct ourselves honorably. So in a way that provokes honor from other people.
Yes.
And so, you know, I was just looking Google Dictionary and seeing what honor actually means. And it means high respect, great esteem. So everyone, we should treat everyone with that attitude, and we should seek to act in a way that would but encourage others to see us in the same way. So it's a full circle, isn't it? Isn't that how it works? So if we do that, then we can honor everyone. I mean, you know, I can think Suella Braverman has some very misguided ideas, but I don't then have to belittle her as a person. I can always seek to find a place to hold her in high esteem, that, you know, to assume that what she's doing because it's of, you know, she has a strong belief in it. And even though I might fundamentally disagree, well, not might, I do, but you know, it's that if we act honorably, then we honor people.
That's a real underlying message.
Yes.
And I think one of the principles of non-violence is that you can disobey the law,
Yes,
regard it as unjust. But then part of disobeying that law is accepting the whatever happens to the consequences of doing that. So in a sense, you are accepting their authority whilst you're challenging it at the same time.
Actually, if you look at verse 16, as servants of God, that word servant could be translated, better translated as slave. As a slave of God in a society, you know, and clearly there are slaves in this community.
Yes.
You know, the people who are slaves, servants of God. So you may be caught up in an institution that is oppressive and restrictive and repressive, but actually you live as a free person, you know, and that's the message of liberation always in any struggle.
Yes.
First of all, free yourself. Who was it said it? Bob Marley. Free yourselves from mental slavery. You know, none but ourselves can free our minds. So that's the sort of starting point of any way of living the Christian life. Maybe we should move on a little bit, because this one is even harder to go from. Where do we go? 8 to 20. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is to your credit if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, where is the credit in that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For you have God's approval. Let's just leave it there. The word slaves there is a different word to the word servant before. This word is the word for a domestic slave. Slavery in Roman times was there were many different aspects of slavery. You know, I mean, the worst would be the criminals, people who were captured as prisoners of war and were sent to the mines or to be gladiators and so on. But within the more urban context that we're looking at now, I mean, many of the slaves would be integral to the family, and many would be educated and given various roles. Many slaves were civil servants, so the institution itself was very, very complex. But here the word is for domestic workers, which implies that in these congregations, there were people who were domestic workers and part of households that had become Christian. In fact, yeah, I mean, the whole thing is about households, really, isn't it? Because later when we talk about wives and husbands, that's about household as well.
I don't agree with it, but I can see where Peter's coming from.
Yeah.
I just don't think I would have ended up where he has. But to me, it's about perspective. That he's basically, by highlighting Jesus at the end of it, in verse 21, he's basically saying, well, Jesus didn't fight back, and as a result, greater things were achieved. And if you fight back, then you're basically, and I think this kind of links with what Peter was just saying about principles of non-violence and protest in that way. If you fight back in the same way as you're being oppressed, then you just end up fighting in the same arena and you change nothing. You just reinforce the system that is there. And in a way you justify slavery in a very peculiar way by fighting back in that way. And the focus is all on the personal, it's not on the group. So he's saying this is what you should do for yourself, but he's not, or I don't, maybe I'm over-interpreting now, but he's not saying, therefore, we shouldn't do anything about it. He's saying, accept your lot, and because that's what happened with Jesus, and he didn't fight back for himself, but in not doing so, then a greater thing was achieved. Freedom was achieved at a greater level. And it seems like there's a kind of, maybe this is a cop-out, but it seems like there's a kind of spiritual principle there, which is beyond the physical and the material. If you stay, we can easily get caught up in the tit for tat of any kind of argument, can't we? But we just end up just dealing with that argument, which isn't fundamentally what any argument is ever about. It's always a symptom of something else.
I mean, I think that's basically, I mean, it's a really difficult, because I mean, it is the principle of civil non-violence. I mean, that you don't react, you don't respond, you don't wait, and you actually shame the person who's doing wrong to you by your acceptance of it. So it's not a passive. It's not being passive at all. And again, it says, you've got God's approval. So I mean, that's a big thing. If you're able to find a different way, of turning the other cheek, as Jesus would have taught, turning the other cheek, and you do that, you have God's approval, which is a massive thing. It's a very strengthening, empowering thing. But what doesn't happen here or anywhere in the New Testament, or actually I think anywhere in the Roman world, is there a questioning of the institution of slavery. Even where there were kind of big slave revolts, there were revolts against the harshness of treatment of the slaves rather than the institution itself. So there's nothing anywhere in the New Testament. It's always about how slaves are treated and how the slaves react, rather than the institution itself.
That just proves, it is disappointing. But then it is a book that is living because it's historically specific. If it, you can't generalize from there to now.
Or to transatlantic slavery, and the fact that these passages were read as justifying slavery, in transatlantic slavery is dreadful. It's wrong. That's not what it's saying.
No.
Anyway, is that okay? Should we move on a little bit? Because this little section that follows really just follows on from what Neil was saying. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were going astray like sheep. Now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your soul. Right. So this is the kind of middle little part. You know, you've got the instruction to everyone, you've got the instructions to slaves. Now you've got the example of Christ as being the kind of pivoting, a pivotal point in Peter's argument. Do you recognize the references there?
Is it to Isaiah?
Yeah, Isaiah 53. And it's a fairly explicit link between Isaiah's prophecy of the suffering servants and Jesus. And it's very, very direct, which is quite interesting because earlier on, I think, in earlier sessions, we saw how Peter, I think last week, we were looking at how Peter understood Old Testament prophets as being pointing to Christ, and we talked about that as a kind of the message of the prophets being for their time, but also speaking about, you know, becoming about the Christ event. And here you've got this right at the center. Christ is the example.
What I think we ought to be aware of, and I wasn't aware of this until recently, but 19 to 25 is sometimes taken as a sort of excuse for domestic abuse. In some Christian circles, women are told when they report to the pastor that my husband's abusing me, well, you've got to endure it because that's what Christ would do. And the reason I know it is we've got a blog post coming up about it next year. But it's just, I think, worth knowing that this passage can be used clearly in some very incredibly unhelpful ways.
I have to say, I find that gobsmacking.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not something I've come across personally, but someone suggested that we did a blog post on this passage, and I've got a couple of people writing on it with different views of what it actually means, but united in the fact that it clearly shouldn't be used to justify. But I can imagine in a certain circles a pastor saying to a woman, well, Jesus suffered and he felt the pain and suffered for doing nothing wrong. You're not doing anything wrong, but you should suffer. And that shows up to your husband. And a bit later on, I think in this passage, it talks about the husband being shown up by the wife's behavior. So I just think it's worth knowing just how dreadfully and awfully and horrifyingly these passages can be used sometimes.
I just think, I don't know why I thought this, but I spent a bit of time, I think probably said so before, in Monrovia during the kind of horrific regime there. And I spent time with the Human Rights Center, and all they could do was monitor the human rights situation. All they could do was record what was happening, because the society was so repressive. There was no way that they could actually stand up against it and resist it, apart from very bravely keeping records of everything that was being done, so that there would be no impunity, and so that they could get that information out to the outside world, so the world outside the country could know, and the international community could respond. And there's a certain extent, you know, these people were just brave enough to put themselves at risk, but if they'd been imprisoned, you know, which they were, I mean, there was nothing they could do change the situation. And I think there are some situations where there is nothing you can do. But the situation that you're talking about, Peter, with a woman in an abusive relationship, something can be done, you know, which is very, very different. I mean, could Jesus do anything about his situation? I mean, you could argue he could do the divine thing and zap the Romans or whatever, you know. But you know, realistically, you know, I mean, he he walked through Jerusalem, he challenged the temple, he challenged the authorities. I mean, at the end of the day, he was, you know, tortured, you know, and imprisoned and tortured. There's nothing he could do at that point. But you couldn't say that Jesus was passive. I don't know, it's a difficult passage.
But the church does valorize suffering. I mean, there's certain,
Yes.
again, certain times and places in the church where suffering is seen as a virtue. If you're suffering, then there's something virtuous about suffering.
Yeah,
And I think that's
that's why I always had such a problem with that Mel Gibson film.
Oh,
I thought it was just appalling.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that it did glorify suffering in a way that was totally unhelpful.
Yeah.
Mm.
And some, I mean, possibly some of the Catholic saints in the past have.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
I mean, Saint Teresa of Lisieux is an example. That there's something seems to be something very holy about someone basically suffering, and I can't see that. I can't see how suffering in its own right can be virtuous. But when people seek suffering, that seems to me like horrendous.
Going back very quickly to the point that was made on domestic abuse,
Hmm.
there are some parts of our faith, some participants who take scripture very literally. To underline the point, we'll just pick out a few verses that suit the point they want to make, taking them completely out of context, not looking at when they were written or who they were written to.
right, let's go on to this great passage now. I mean, what do we make of this one? Wives, in
Oh,
the
it's
same
fine.
way,
There's no problem. It's so fine.
accept the authority of your husband, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Rather, let your adornment be the inner self, with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. It was in this way long ago that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. For Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is good and never let fear alarm you. This is a really difficult passage.
When I had my ear pierced back in the 80s, I was in a Baptist church in Hull, and I had a woman berate me because she'd said she'd never pierced her ears because of this passage.
Right.
And how dare I be able to? It's a complete affront to her.
Quite right.
I really had no response. I'm not sure I do now, but this is what?
I think what is really interesting is that in the society, a woman had to have the faith of the husband. So whatever religious practice of the father of the family, the husband, practiced, the woman had an obligation to do that. But these women are Christian women. I mean, the bit about the wives seems to be about wives who are believers with non-believing husbands. And that's quite challenging, because they shouldn't be believers. They should follow what the husband said.
I see. Okay.
So in a way, what he's saying is, you know, okay, don't rock the boat too much in this family, but he's not saying don't believe. He's saying do believe. He's saying follow this new faith that you've found.
What if their husbands wanted them to adorn themselves?
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, when you start to unpack it, you see that the women are in quite a vulnerable situation in relationship to their husbands in that society. But the use of the reference to Sarah is interesting. Sarah obeyed Abraham. Do you remember what she did?
Was it to do with slaughtering a lamb or something like that? Slaughtering food for them?
She got married off to Pharaoh or something, didn't she?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
He gave her away.
Yeah.
He said,
Pretended she was his sister. That's right. Yes.
yeah.
And used her as a weapon, really,
Yeah.
so God would strike down. Yeah.
I don't think there's a kind of reference to her calling him Lord, but I mean it is a it's a tough little passage. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks, yeah, I can see this in the context of the time, and I can see what he's saying in terms of graciousness and turning the other cheek as a form of resistance. But it doesn't quite cut the mustard, really.
No, one of the things that I find really difficult here is, the phrase Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And, I think, somewhere in the Roman ideology was this idea that, what the Roman Empire was good because it had brought peace to the world, or to, to the Mediterranean. And it's sort of, I suppose, implicitly saying, well, we've got to do, all this stuff to evildoers so that the Pax Romana may survive.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a certain degree of pragmatism in it as well. Yeah.
Yes. And of course, it means that there's no, societies can't evolve into more egalitarian ones, because you have this apparatus of the Pax Romana, which you're told was the, is that it's keeping everybody alive and at peace and not slaughtered by the barbarians.
Katrina, I'm sort of reluctant to ask you this, but what do you think of this passage? There you go.
Probably, similar things to what you all are saying. I think what jumps out to me, though, in this is the phrase about the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Because I think that is something that even in today's society, I think the expectation that a woman should be a bit demure and should have, like, that gentleness and quietness are the virtues of being like a good woman, which I think is problematic. And I think there are examples of women in like the Old Testament who were leaders. And so, yeah, I struggle with it a bit, because I wonder how much of this is the author just inputting, their own values, or I'm sure it was like a widespread value within society, and versus what is the like actual truth that can be learned from this.
It's interesting. I mean, one of the things is that in the Roman society, the clothes that you wear denoted your status. So there would be a sense in which you were not using your clothes to say who you were in the society. But I mean, I don't think that takes detracts from what you're saying in terms of, you know, contemporary ways. Just quickly moving on. I mean, I just thought where I leave that is, you know, I can sort of get there, but I can sort of maybe see where he is at in his own time, but I can't see how you can move it forward into our own time, or should feel obliged to. Although I do think it's interesting that when he talks about the husbands, he's obviously talking about believing husbands in a believing household, which is different to the situation that the wives are in. So husbands, in the same way, show consideration for your wives in your life together, paying honor again to the woman as the weaker sex. Well, you know, and assuming means physically weaker. I don't know, but
no, he doesn't.
All right, okay. I was being generous. Since they too are also heirs of the gracious gift of life. So there is a sense of equality there, even though it's got that awful phrase weaker sex in there, so that nothing may hinder your prayers. So, and finally, I mean, we haven't got much time left, but and finally, there's this instruction to all in this last section, which is to all in the sort of Christian family, continuing this kind of household code thing. Finally, all of you have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. For those who desire life and desire to see good days, let them keep their tongue from evil and their lips from speaking deceit. Let them turn away from evil and do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So he sums it up with Jesus' teaching, basically. Don't repay evil for evil, abuse for abuse. Repay with a blessing. Sermon on the Mount stuff, and then a quote there from Psalm 34. We'll just quickly move on. We might have to do a little bit of the rest next week. Just on this last little section of chapter 13. Now, who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? Even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated. In your heart, sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an account of the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good. Suffering should be God's will than to suffer for doing evil. Christ also suffered for sin once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 people, were saved through water, and baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers made subject to him. Yeah, so that's I think that's just looking at that. It's kind of summing up, isn't it, what's been said before. Even if you suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. You have God's approval. You are God's slave. You are free. God has made you free, a free person with God. So even if you are in this situation of persecution and suffering, you can be empowered. And then this idea of sanctifying Christ as Lord, hallowed be your name, we say, you know, sanctifying Christ the Lord. And I love this idea of be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an account of the hope that is in you. So, all of this, you know, non-violent resistance to the oppression and repression is somehow or other a manifestation of this living hope that is talked about earlier in the letter.
I think we need to be careful, like Peter said earlier, that, you know, we don't end up glorifying suffering. And I think this passage again is like that. And I think, you know, there are, even in our society, there are Christian organizations, who I won't name, who infuriate me, because when a person who happens to be a Christian has something happen against them, they'll then defend them on the basis that they're being persecuted in the workplace or something. And, you know, more often than not, they're just wrong, or they've been an arse. And what happened was just, and it isn't about persecution. But sometimes I think we look for persecution to justify our faith, and it's not ours to look for. It may happen, it may not. That shouldn't make a difference to our faith. As a result, we should stay strong either way. And I think that's the danger that we have in a society that, quite frankly, is incredibly tolerant of Christianity, and sometimes perhaps over tolerant of some of the wackier things that shouldn't be.
I think there is a sense in which those who've had privilege in the past, because an unnecessary and unjust privilege in the past, when that privilege is taken away from them in the present, then they see that as persecution rather than being removed of privilege they should never have in the first place. And I think that explains a lot of these feelings on the part of people who feel they're being oppressed for this and that and the other.
Well, I think what we don't know when we read this letter is really what the persecution was.
No.
We don't know how severe it was, because we don't know when the letter was written. The kind of general persecutions that take place in the 2nd century, but there were outbursts of persecutions, you know, as we know, and there were local persecutions, so localized attacks on Christians, and it's obvious that these people are very alienated from the surroundings, that they are trying to live a very, very countercultural lifestyle as a new community, bringing something new in, and under an emperor, you know, under an empire, and a pretty repressive empire. So it's kind of easy to look into these passages from the perspective of, as you said, Neil, you know, a society which is tolerant and open, and where we can freely practice being Christian, and we don't need to kind of make up persecutions that don't exist, you know, and wrongdoings that don't exist. But there are other societies where those situations are very real.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about religious persecution, but, you know, human rights abuses and general repression. And I think often what's lost when people look at very severe situations of religious persecution, whether it's Christians or Muslims or whoever, is that they are generally part of a general repressive society. And it's not just the people of faith who are suffering because of faith. It's people of faith resisting a wider persecution, rather wider abuse of human rights that then puts people in a position of risk and danger. So I mean, I'm just trying to defend Peter here. You may think I'm defending the indefensible, but
yes,
sorry, Graham.
I think one thing I find very difficult about this book is that it's actually written in quite good Greek. So, you know, the author, whether he was Peter or not, must have had a fairly good education. So that, you know, I mean, you know, in a certain way, he's writing as an outsider, but he's also writing as an insider. And there is quite, you know, there's quite a lot of tension between his, you know, his inside position and his outside position. And I think a lot of the, you know, a lot of the sort of contorted rhetoric of the book is the author trying to reconcile his inside status with his outside status.
Yeah.
And he's outside in the sense that he's writing from Rome to a group of churches that are under some form of persecution or whatever. So he's not in their situation. He's writing to them, advising them, supporting them, encouraging them, saying you may feel you're under, you may feel you're slaves and being abused and so on, but really you're free. You know, you are really beloved of God. You know, you are really free people. You are have God's approval, and you're doing something completely different, completely outside, and really tough things going on. But remember, you do it as empowered people, you know, not disempowered. It's the society that disempowers you. It's God who empowers you. I mean, I think that's.